Welcome to For the Record. I'm Will Keneally. It's been a busy political week with the presidential visits and the state's spring election. Presidential primary was already decided, but we saw tens of thousands of Wisconsinites vote for other options than the two frontrunners. Here with a breakdown of what we saw on Tuesday is Charles Franklin, director of the Marquette Law School poll. And thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to first start there. One of the big questions I think on a lot of people's minds is those kind of other votes on the Dem side, the uninstructed, on the Republican side for, Nikki Haley, Ron DeSantis. Is that concerning for some of these frontrunners at all?
I think it's a notice that in both parties we have some people who are not happy with the frontrunners or the presumptive nominees now. 11% did not vote for Joe Biden in the Democratic primary, and 21% didn't vote for Donald Trump. So basically twice as many Republicans didn't vote for Trump as Democrats didn't vote for Biden. Both of those are signals that the parties have not completely unified behind their nominee. We might have seen 97, 98% in previous races with clear frontrunners who had wrapped up the nomination. Whether those people would actually cross over to vote for the other party in the fall, I think is a much bigger question. But as we know, turnout matters. And so do those disaffected Republicans and disaffected Democrats think about not voting for president in the fall, or think about possibly voting third party? That's what we've got 6+ months of campaigning to do to try to influence them to line up behind their party's nominee, even if they're discontented with them. Or from the other party, maybe think about crossing over.
The thing that's always striking me, too, is this is the second time that we've seen Trump on a competitive Republican ballot here in Wisconsin. Back in 2016, we voted for Ted Cruz here in Wisconsin. Have we seen now kind of a reversion or a change in Wisconsin? Are we Trump country now?
We're Trump country, but with some holdouts, I think is the way I'd put it. In our polling over the last couple of years, among Republicans, we've generally seen about 70% who said they had a favorable view of Trump and about 30% unfavorable. And those unfavorables were heavily going to Haley at the end. In the last couple of polls, we've seen that number improve for Trump a little bit. He's getting up closer to 80% favorable with Republicans. But that leaves the 20% unfavorable, which happens to be almost exactly the 21% we saw not vote for him in the primary.
I'm also fascinated to kind of one of the smaller down-ballot races that we saw on Tuesday. And maybe I'm just too much of a political nerd, which is fine. But the race for Wausau, we had Katie Rosenberg, who I think was widely kind of understood to be a rising star in Democratic or liberal politics, lose her Wausau mayoral race. Is that any kind of omen, or is that just a local Marathon County race?
I'd try not to read too much into it, but I wouldn't discount it completely either. Rosenberg was a first-term mayor. She was just elected 4 years ago, was running against another city council member in this race. She ended up losing 52 to 48. So a pretty close race, but a 4-point victory for the person who won. There was issues about utility bills going up. People may remember that Wausau found PFAS contamination in all of their drinking wells, put in new plants to solve that problem, which apparently they do properly filter it out, but it's not free. And so the costs of doing that have meant rising utility rates, and that was a key theme in the campaign against her. I do think that this does remove a rising star on the Democratic side. Now, mayors are nonpartisan races here, but Rosenberg had certainly associated herself with Democrats around the state. And so her loss of this race is a setback to at least one potential future candidate in statewide races.
One of the other kind of proxy races that we saw on Tuesday were for those constitutional amendments. They're GOP authored, certainly, and we'd kind of equated those to be, conservatives would support them, and possibly drive conservative turnout. Is that kind of what we saw happen in this Tuesday's election?
I'm very dubious that those two amendments drove turnout. Compared to the attention that's paid to the presidential primaries, those amendments or referenda were pretty low-key affairs. Over the last 20 or so years, about 80% of proposed amendments have passed. And so it's not shocking that these would pass. My bet, though, is that while some really tuned into political circles would have gotten the yes or no signal from their party, a lot of people probably read that amendment for the very first time on their ballots. And the way they were worded was not perhaps frightening. And so it seems common sense, vote yes on these. There's been a strategy from time to time to use referenda as a way to drive turnout. But I think these referenda were of interest to a segment of Republican voters, but really weren't motivating for most voters around the state.
We were chatting a little bit earlier. Certainly, it was a little bit bad weather in Wisconsin. Do you have a sense of whether, if that at all, affects turnout?
You know, I'd love to see whether those places that got the hardest rain or snow really did turn out at lower levels. Our turnout was just about 1.2 million. You'd have to go back to 2012 to find one lower at 1.1 million. And, you know, weather happens all the time. But in 2016, we were much higher. In 2020, we were quite a bit higher. I would say the biggest thing I'd point to is to remind people that if 1.2 million turned out on Tuesday, 3.3 million turned out in 2020 for the general election in November. So there's 2.1 million people, more or less, who are going to show up at the polls next November that weren't voting this past Tuesday. And that's just a reminder to everybody that that 2.2 million vote is going to play a much bigger role in the outcome of the fall election than these interesting tea leaves about this Tuesday's primary. I think the Tuesday primary is interesting. I think these divides within the party are well worth knowing. But I would just point out that there's an awful lot of people that haven't voted yet and haven't spoken, therefore.
Ask you too, you always kind of mention with some of the polls that you put out too, it's a little bit more of a snapshot in time than, you know, indicative of broad trends. Is that the same for this election?
Yeah, I think absolutely. The one thing that's different this year is we have one current and one former president. So people have a much better idea of who these people are and what they did or would do in office than is normal when you have an incumbent and a non-incumbent, let alone two fresh faces. So to that extent, we might expect less change over this year than we would see otherwise. But when you look at how many people are dissatisfied with both candidates, that's running close to 20%. You look at the potential appeal of third-party candidates, and you account for 6 more months of advertising and campaign events and seeing how they do in debates, if we have debates. And we're currently running 12% or so that say they don't know who they would vote for. Put all of those things together, and it may not be huge changes in the vote or preferences over the next few months, but there's certainly room for enough change to come to tilt this election one way or another. So for that, I would say, yes, each poll and each primary election is a snapshot of where things stand today, but they sure could change by the time we get to November.
Well, a lot to look out for. Charles Franklin, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, when we come back, we recap the former president's trip to Green Bay and preview President Biden's trip to Madison tomorrow. We sit down with a Trump campaign official about why the intense focus on Wisconsin. We'll be right back after this.